In the course of modern history, when one country, state, or empire chooses to wage war upon someone, it often does so with some sort of ideological basis behind it, something intended to justify or add legitimacy to the decision to invade, even if only a token or a dishonest one. The justification could be historical disagreements over territory and land division. Other times it may be portrayed as a tactical or preemptive attack intended to curtail the ability of the enemy to wage war upon them if they had been preparing to do so. Other times still, the reason may be the supposed mistreatment of a minority by the state being targeted. In other words, a sort of protectionist intervention to alleviate the suffering at the hands of the host state. The Russian war in Ukraine has been justified by the invading state and its executor-in-chief at various times, practically all of the above. This has included historical claims of the Crimean Peninsula, the supposed infringement by Ukraine upon Russian speakers' rights, and the perceived security risk posed by Ukraine as a proxy for NATO, etc. But behind this creative kaleidoscope of reasons for the invasion, some suggest that there is, in fact, one ideologue whose dictums are the actual driving force behind Russia's warmongering over the past 2 decades. A man seemed to be Putin's consigliere, or a figure playing the modern Rasputin to the modern-day Russian Tsar, and whose whims are those which underpin the Russian state's actions. That man is Alexander Dugin. His profile, his ideologies, and his philosophy of non-Eurasianism will be the subject of our video today, so let's dive in. Just before we continue with today's episode, have you ever wondered how much of your personal information is floating around there on the internet? It can be kind of scary to think about, but I've got some good news for you. There is a solution that can help protect your data, and it's called Incogni, today's sponsor. Imagine someone just looking you up and finding out where you live, your phone number, even details about your family. It really can be that easy, and that's where Incogni comes in. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf and get them to remove your personal data from their websites. The process is super simple. You just create an account, you give Incogni the go-ahead to act on your behalf, and you sit back and you relax while they handle all of the dirty work. And they don't stop after just the first round. They keep at it, ensuring that your data stays off the market. Did you know that data brokers even can sell your information to scammers? With Incogni, those risks are drastically reduced. So, if you value your privacy and want to take control of your personal data, give Incogni a try. Use my promo code WarGraphics at the link below and you'll get 60% off an annual plan. Again, incogni.com/WarGraphics. Use my code, 60% off. And thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. And now back to it. Despite operating largely in the wings of the Russian political machine, Alexander Dugin, to scholars of Russian political strategy in the last few years, is a well-known and much-documented figure. Dugin was born to a highly ranked military family in Moscow in 1962. From a young age, he exhibited a keen interest in philosophy, mysticism, and radical political theories. In the 70s, he, for some time, attended the Moscow Aviation Institution before being expelled, supposedly for his embrace of anti-communist ideas. He first began to rise to prominence as an opponent of the communist system in his twilight embers in the 1980s, having become involved in various dissident movements that opposed the regime. These movements were often intellectual circles, where like-minded individuals, informative poets, philosophers, artists, and musicians could share their criticism of the system and discuss alternative political and philosophical ideas. One group Dugin reportedly became associated with was the Yazinski Circle, which was interested in the study of European and Oriental mysticism, black magic, and the occult. The circle operated in secrecy due to the risk of persecution by the KGB and other state security apparatuses, and Dugin's involvement in such environments exposed him to an emerging blend of anti-communist but distinctly Russian nationalist literature, much of which was nonetheless banned in the Soviet Union. This environment fostered Dugin's evolving sentiments and his interest in radical political ideologies. During this time, in Moscow, Dugin also rubbed shoulders with Eduard Limonov, a controversial novelist, poet, and libertine. In 1993, the pair founded what would become known as the National Bolshevik Party, or NBP, alongside rock musicians Yegor Letov and Sergei Kurykin. The NBP was a political youth organization which combined Russian ultranationalism and anti-Western sentiment with left-wing patriotism and elements of punk and other subcultures. It was described by Radio Free Europe as employing a, quote, bizarre mixture of totalitarian and fascist symbols, geopolitical dogma, and national patriotic demagoguery. Dugin and his followers left the organization in 1997, while Limonov continued to serve as its founding leader until the NBP ultimately fell foul of Russian authorities and was outright banned in 2007. Although their alliance was short-lived, The period represented a cornerstone in Dugin's later ideas and further sharpened his ideological stance against communism. It was also in the 1990s that Dugin became a prominent advocate of Eurasianism, something which would become the core of Dugin's ideological framework. In essence, Eurasianism dictated that Russian could not be understood as either a Western or Oriental culture and should instead be understood as a separate civilization entirely. The theory traced its origins to the period following the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, being rolled out largely through the writing of the émigré writer Nikolai Trubetskoy. Trubetskoy sought to portray Russia as an elaborate mix of Turkic, Slavic, Mongol, and other Asian origins, and a sort of antidote to the West, which he considered decadent and of which he was bitterly critical. He called on Russian intellectuals to free themselves from their fixation on Europe while emphasizing the legacy of Genghis Khan to create a great continent-spanning Russian-Eurasian state. Fast forward to the 1990s, and Dugin's ideas on Eurasianism, termed as Neo-Eurasianism, were put forward in a 1997 book that he authored called The Foundations of Geopolitics. This became a lauded work in Russia and compulsory reading in the Academy of the General Staff of the country's armed forces for some time thereafter. For Dugin, Neo-Eurasianism was not just a geopolitical strategy that advocated an expansive and powerful Russian state as advocated by Trubetskoy, but also a sort of cultural and pseudo-spiritual mission. He believes in the revival of traditional values and the rejection of Western liberalism, which he sees as immoral and corrupting. This includes a strong emphasis on Orthodox Christianity, authoritarian governance, and the complete rejection of globalism and cosmopolitanism. The pseudo-religious element in Dugin's withering criticism of the West is present in his writing, going on to describe the West as the kingdom of the Antichrist and its rise as, quote, the fact of the apocalypse. And one other consistent theme throughout Dugin's work is some very stark statements about the status and future of Ukraine, but more on that later. Despite its large variety of very extreme positions, the popularity of the Foundations of Geopolitics, especially in the final years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency and the Smuta of the 1990s, propelled him to prominence and allowed him access to the esteemed position of the head of the sociology department at Moscow State University. This despite having very few actual academic credentials other than his various publications. Ultimately, Dugin's ideas would also find a home in the mind of an ambitious political figure who was rising fast to dominate Russian politics in the late 90s and early 2000s, and who, it is said, would later use his ideas as a dictum upon which to base his strategic decisions. And that person, of course, is Vladimir Putin. Alexander Dugin's relationship with the Russian dictator is pretty complex. Although Dugin is often portrayed as a significant influence on Putin's geopolitical strategy, particularly in Western media, Dugin and Putin are rarely seen publicly interacting. Still, the former's suspected close ties and influence over Putin have resulted in some comparing him to the 19th century monk and mystic Grigory Rasputin, well known and despised for his alleged influence over the Romanovs, the Tsarist family which ruled Russia for centuries until their overthrow in 1917. And it is true that Dugin and Putin share a lot of precise ideological affinities, particularly in their opposition to Western liberalism and their vision of a strong, assertive Russia. In the early days of the Russia-Ukrainian War in 2014, Putin made use of the term Novorossiya to describe the easternmost regions of Ukraine, making use of an old historical Russian imperial concept which portrayed the regions as an extension of Russian land. It is thought that this term, which had been largely discarded before the start of the war, and later returns largely to disuse as the war progressed, had been brought back into vogue largely by Dugin, who made frequent use of it in his 2009 book and throughout 2014. That said, Dugin's influence can be seen in the broader intellectual and political environment of Russia. His ideas resonate with many in the Russian elite and have found an audience among many nationalists and conservative thinkers. This ideological alignment has helped to create an atmosphere in which Putin's actions, such as the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, can be justified within the framework of Eurasianism. And a large part of Dugin's visions in this regard is encapsulated by what he calls the fourth political theory, something he put forward in a book of the same name, which was published in 2009. In the fourth political theory, Dugin characterized contemporary world history as a struggle between three competing political ideologies: communism, liberalism, and fascism. According to Dugin, the second and third of these, fascism and communism, failed and were overcome by liberalism, which he declared to now be the dominant political order in most of the world. Liberalism, for Dugin, was an extension of the American political, social, and economic system, one of decadence and moral decline, and one which aimed to suck the entire world into its orbit. He further described the traditional left-right paradigm as effectively meaningless, and that the liberal order represented a moral degeneracy disguised under the cloak of progress, which individual civilizations must make great efforts to counter. To do so, Dugin wrote that a fourth political theory was necessary, one which would help countries avert the pull of Western liberalism and act as a counterbalance to the American-led interference which threatened to subsume them. Despite this, Dugin's rambling text offers only a very vague vision of what this fourth political theory should actually look like, focusing instead on the degeneracy of the liberal system as he saw it. A central underlying element of Dugin's positions in the fourth political theory stemmed from two landmark books on political theory from the 1990s, namely Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, and Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Francis Fukuyama had claimed that with the collapse of the communist system in the Eastern Bloc and the earlier demise of fascism after World War II, liberal democracy had triumphed as the dominant political system in the world, and that it was the one which best conformed to human instinct. Huntington, for his part, in a highly controversial but also widely cited work, claimed that history would be better understood as the constant collision between various actors for supremacy. He added that civilizations, separated by a combination of religion, language, history, and other elements of culture, would continue to fight one another for supremacy. In his book, Dugin largely rejected Fukuyama's conclusion, arguing historical trends and evidence from recent political struggles supported Samuel Huntington's concept of the inevitable conflict between civilizations, and that this was something which had actually become sped up by the collapse of the communist system, rather than ending it. With that said, Dugin's book offered a very subjective take on contemporary European history, somewhat resembling Vladimir Putin's meandering account of the course of European history during his infamous interview with Tucker Carlson in 2024. Moreover, Dugin specifically highlighted certain select countries as steadfastly upholding their own individual civilization and human values. These included China, Venezuela, and Iran, countries not only accused of gross human rights violations, but also, surprise, surprise, allies and strategic partners of Russia. The fourth political theory was published only 1 year after Russia invaded Georgia in the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, during the course of which Dugin had visited the Russian-backed breakaway states over which the invasion had been carried out. Given its themes, the book became seen by many as an endorsement of Russian influence secured through violent means and a justification of its military intervention to previously Russian-aligned countries as a means to deter them from ever seriously considering leaving its orbit. Separately, Dugin also received notoriety for his close ties to far-right figures in Europe and elsewhere, links which would have appeared to stand at great odds with the positions outlined in his text, which ostensibly rejected fascism as a spent and defeated ideology and one judged undesirable for a future society. According to Open Democracy, Dugin had celebrated the rebirth of what he called fascist fascism in the 1990s, and had praised Reinhard Heydrich, a key figure of the Holocaust, for being a convinced Eurasian. In both The Foundations of Geopolitics and The Fourth Political Theory, Dugin spoke glowingly of figures associated with the European New Right, such as the controversial French philosopher Alain de Benoist. And he also wrote in defense of cultural figures such as Dudon Mabala, a French entertainer who was convicted on several occasions of anti-Semitism, but who Dugin characterized instead as a victim of institutionalized left liberal anti-racism. Now, one might be tempted to say that Dugin's ideas, like those of many political theorists, especially those promoting fringe political theories on the left and right, would be influential only in relatively niche circles of thought and in academia, but otherwise would have little to no bearing on world events. Unfortunately, however, Dugin's ideas appear to have a direct and very real influence on world events, most specifically on Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. A large part of Dugin's current notoriety stems from his aggressive positions on Ukraine and the Russian invasion, for which he is seen in large part as one of the driving ideological inspirations. Dugin's stance on the reintegration of post-Soviet states under the Russian umbrella, in some ways a continuation of the forced assimilation carried out on minority populations during the Soviet period, has remained relatively consistent throughout his work, pausing only to de-emphasize communism as a channel with which to achieve this. In the Foundations of Geopolitics, Dugin made the following statement with regard to Ukraine. Ukraine, as an independent state with some kind of territorial ambitions, poses a huge threat to the whole of Eurasia, and without solving the Ukrainian problem at all, it makes no sense to talk about continental geopolitics. Strategically, Ukraine should be strictly a projection of Moscow to the south and west. Dugin's rejection of Ukraine's right to sovereignty was one of the relatively few consistent themes in his work, and his positions have included an increasingly virulent line on its independence, which he stated in 2014, quoting again, "Ukraine has to be either vanished from the earth and rebuilt from scratch, or people need to get it. I think kill, kill, and kill. No more talk anymore. It is my opinion as a professor." The quote ends. Furthermore, Dugin also claimed that the West was using Ukraine as a pawn to defeat Russia, and that its evolving ties with the West were nothing more than a cynical play by the United States to expand its influence at Russia's expense, furthermore stating that Ukraine had no geopolitical meaning, geographic uniqueness, or ethnic exclusiveness, and emphasizing its close link to elements of Russian identity instead. It is the positions of Dugin which are seen by many as being the original blend behind the 2021 essay which appeared on Vladimir Putin's official presidential website entitled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." This essay is seen as the blueprint for the subsequent full-scale ground invasion of Ukraine, an event which began only 6 months after the essay was published. And it was in the intermediate aftermath of that same invasion by Russian forces in February 2022 that in a video released to his Telegram account, Dugin displayed an even darker view on the conflict. In a 22-minute lecture, he declared that Fukuyama's theory on liberal democracy as the system best suited to human societies was in fact completely wrong, that Huntington's theory on the clash of civilizations was completely right, while also confusingly claiming that the Russian invasion was necessary as the only option to prove Huntington's position correct. He continued that the war with Ukraine was an inevitability, that this was a means for Russia to reassert its sovereignty, and claiming also that this sovereignty was something Putin had been trying for 20 years to accomplish through peaceful means. Dugin played a direct role in some areas of the Russian invasion, both by signing up volunteers to fight alongside Russian-backed separatists in the wake of the outbreak of hostilities through his Eurasian Youth Union, and also by writing regular texts in support of the war in the online blog Geopolitica, available in 18 languages, and offering a highly subjective take on the war and its proceedings, ostensibly targeted towards an international audience. But with all his saber-rattling and the prominent positions he occupied both in the lead-up to and in the wake of the full-scale invasion, it was not long before the public's attention, which had to some extent escaped him outside of Russia, would be brought to an end. And it would be brought to an end in a bloody fashion. On the 20th of August 2022, 6 months after the beginning of the invasion, in a small village near Moscow. On the evening in question, Dugin was returning from an art festival with an entourage of family and friends when a car bomb exploded, ripping his vehicle to pieces. As it happened, Dugin had decided to switch cars at the last moment, meaning that the bomb, for which he was most likely the intended target, didn't harm him, but instead it killed the person who'd been traveling in the car. In his place, Dugin's 29-year-old daughter, Daya. Daya Dugina was a media figure and political commentator who had been an advocate for her father's Eurasianist ideas and the continuation of the war in Ukraine, with some media outlets speculating that she might even have been the target of the attack alongside her father. Responsibility for the attack was contested, with many suspecting Ukrainian involvement, although this was something Ukraine was quick to deny. The Russian Security Service, the Federal Security Bureau, claimed that responsibility for the attack lay with a Ukrainian citizen and sympathizer of Ukraine's Azov regiment who had managed to flee across the border into Estonia, something Estonia and Ukraine alike equally refuted. Others placed the blame elsewhere, with Ilya Ponomarov, a fugitive Russian MP and ally of Ukraine, claiming the attack was the work of the National Republican Army, an alleged group of Russian dissidents opposed to Putin. It was even claimed that the attack was orchestrated by enemies of Dugin within the Russian political establishment, especially those dissatisfied with the level of influence he exerted over Putin. It is worth noting here that Dugin, despite the relative popularity of his ideas, is almost certainly not short of enemies. The Dugin family's close association with nationalist and far-right groups might have made them a target for factions within the Russian elite seeking to consolidate power or eliminate rivals. And as with the real-life Rasputin, there were likely also some who were unhappy with his closeness to the state leader, who would seek his elimination as a means to supplant him. However, to allow an individual or organization to carry out an attack on Russian soil and to succeed in fleeing over the border into another country would, if accurate, represent a curious failure by the long-established Russian federal security apparatus, something which rendered Russia's account of the circumstances behind the attack rather dubious. YouTuber and political analyst Vlad Vexler further cast doubt on the responsibility of Ukraine for the attack, reasoning that if Ukraine had the capability and resources to infiltrate Russia and carry out such an assassination to do away with Dugin, this would be akin to, quote, carrying out an armed robbery only to steal a haddock. But regardless of the ultimate responsibility, the killing of Dugin elicited a strong response from Russian authorities and nationalist groups, with many viewing it as a direct attack on the ideological vanguard of Russian nationalism. The event also heightened security concerns among elites in Russia who publicly supported the war, especially in the wake of a string of such attacks which eliminated several notable figures on Russia's own soil, including war blogger Vladimir Tatarsky, former submarine commander Stanislav Rozhitsky, and one-time Ukrainian MP Ilya Kiva. For many in the West, who until that point had not heard of Alexander Dugin, the event was also shocking and drew attention to Dugin's prominent family connections and the political implications of a death. As video images of a shocked Dugin standing at the scene of the attack moments after it unfolded were broadcast to audiences around the world, the event and the potential motivations behind it catapulted him into the spotlight as myriad Western and non-Western media outlets reported on and analyzed the attack and its ramifications. For his part, since the attack, Dugin himself doubled down upon his central ideas. At his daughter's memorial service, Dugin claimed that the front of the war had reached Russia, seemingly implicitly calling on Russians to take up the mantle of the war effort to defend their own personal interests and those of the state. Dugin called for renewed vigor in Russia's war against Ukraine, claiming that his daughter had laid down her life on the altar of Russian victory. In his own interview with Tucker Carlson in 2024, Dugin continued his diatribe against the West, arguing that it had placed the individual at the center of its worldview at great cost to community, family, and the state, amidst a series of other attacks on transgenderism, neoliberalism, and artificial intelligence. He also reiterated his assessment of Putin as a defender of traditional values and stated his belief in Russophobia as being at the heart of the, quote, hatred of Putin. While the exact perpetrators of the attack and their motivations remain uncertain, the event highlighted the dangerous intersection of ideology, politics, and violence in Russia today. As with many elements of the Russian war, the future for Russia, and for the actors involved in dictating it, appears unclear. Alexander Dugin remains a key and shadowy figure in Russian political thought, whose advocacy of Eurasianism provides a cultural and ideological foundation for those who support a strong, independent Russia opposed to Western influence. While his direct influence on Vladimir Putin may be limited, his ideas contribute to the broader ideological context in which Russian policy is formulated and understood. And it's worth mentioning that in many ways, Dugin's positions seem significantly more hardline, even than Putin himself, advocating a terrible war against Ukraine. However, this is also something which could, in theory, prove to be his undoing. To appear to portray Vladimir Putin as not going far enough in the conflict would be very risky business indeed, something which Dugin has flirted with on several occasions. If there is something that Putin has quite decisively proven in the past, it is his readiness to do away with former allies if they fail to toe the line of his authority, something perhaps best shown by the demise of Yevgeny Prigozhin in August 2023. In addition, as mentioned before, Dugin is not shy of enemies externally, and not even his standing in Russia is grounded in rock-solid foundations. Dugin left his professorship at Moscow State University in 2014 under rather obscure circumstances. Many have claimed that this was due to the outrage and revulsion generated by his infamous kill, kill, and kill statements regarding Ukraine. If this is so, it would indicate that even the 21st century Rasputin, much as his predecessor, is, to some degree at least, not entirely above domestic scrutiny and attack. And in the murky world of the Russian political sphere, it is perhaps only with a strong circle behind you that political, or indeed physical, survival is secure.